Would you like to know how you should be conducting your interviews as you start to hire your members for data teams? Hi, my name is Jesse Anderson and I'm the author of Data Teams. This is the third in a series of 4 videos from my book Data Teams, where I'm going through and talking about some of the issues that we hit with data teams. In this video, I'm going to share some of the insights and some of the issues that management has when we start to conduct our interviews to hire new members for data teams. To start off with, I want to reiterate and really make it clear why you want to spend so much time, especially initially, with your hires. And this is because initial bad hires are really going to kill you. And this isn't a theoretical thing. This is something I know firsthand. I've seen this firsthand, where a client has made an initial bad hire, and what it happens is they will make that hire, but that hire won't just not do anything. In other words, they won't just have zero productivity. The worst part actually is they will drag down the productivity of your other people. Your senior and lead people, they will be asking them the questions, they will be bugging them, they will be forcing them to think about other things, figure out their problems. There is a dragging down of productivity of the entire team. Another big reason we want to look at this is that the bad decisions of those hires aren't just stopped once they're fired or they move on to a different opportunity. Those bad decisions actually last well beyond their tenure. In these sorts of situations, it can actually take months or even years, depending on how long they were running, what they were doing, to actually go through and undo those mistakes. These mistakes, these early bad decisions, are really going to kill you. With that said, let's talk about the resumes and some of the issues that can happen there. First off, I want you to know that their resumes can deceive, and this deception can be both intentional and just a lack of knowledge on your part of what's out there. A common example of what's just out there is that there are actually 2 types of industry accepted definitions of data engineers. One definition of a data engineer is a very SQL focused person. This person is often doing data warehousing, is a DBA, is doing SQL developer, ETL developer. Those are the sorts of titles that sometimes are given to people with that data engineering definition. And then there's a separate definition that I go through in my book, and that is a software engineer who has taken their skills and focused them or specialized them in big data. And this is a very, very different type of data engineer. One being a SQL focused person, the other one being a software engineer. And as a direct result, we need to actually vet these people to make sure that their definition is actually meeting our definition. So when we have our job description, for example, we need to be clear. We want data engineers who can program. One thing that can often happen there is the sort of SQL focused people will put some programming on their experience, or they'll keyword stuff their resumes. There can be issues. So what I suggest people do is have a manager vet them initially. What we want to do is we want to prevent a lot of time wasting for the rest of the team by setting up a series of interviews for somebody who isn't remotely qualified just from the get-go. This will prevent a lot of time wasting for the rest of the team. As a result, when we do our interviews, we need to do 2 things. We need to do our technical interview, and then we'll need to do our culture and fit interview. That culture and fit interview will obviously depend on the company, what the company values, but I'm going to go deeper into the technical interviews needed for the 3 members of the data teams. To start off with, let's talk about our data engineer. And in that interview, we have to cover 2 things. As you remember, my definition of a data engineer was a software engineer who specializes in big data technologies. As a result, when we do our interviews, we have to validate our data engineer for both of those things. We have to validate that they can be a software engineer and that they can do the big data side of things. Let's go deeper into the software engineering side. You heard me talk about the lack of coding or the importance of coding. Some people may not be able to code and will call themselves a data engineer. During this interview, we need to absolutely verify that the person can code. And it's not just a matter of coding, but we also need to make sure that they are using the best practices for software engineering. Do they use source control? Do they comment their code? Do they do this and this? Part of the value, or part of what a data engineer will often have to do is they will have to mentor others, especially the data scientists, on best practices. We want to make sure that the data engineers themselves are doing these best practices in order to pass them on to the data scientists. Then we move on to our big data interview. We need to make sure that the person understands the issues of scale. Do they understand why we can't hold everything in memory, for example? Do they understand how do you, for example, parallelize certain algorithms? These are parts of that interview. Oftentimes a team will have an idea of what technologies they want to use. During this interview, they'll want to make sure that they actually know those technologies, not just the ones that they've said, but we need to make sure that if somebody is putting a technology on their resume, that we've actually validated that they can actually use that technology. Then we have our data scientist interviews. And here we have several different issues or different themes that we have to go through with our data scientists. We have to make sure that the data scientists can do both sides of what needs to happen. They need to apply their math skills as well as their programming skills. Now here is a difference in the programming level. The data scientists will generally want to be at an intermediate level coding skill. Now this isn't to say it's a non-existent coding skill level. In my opinion, that doesn't make them a data scientist if they can't code. But we do want an intermediate level. They need to know at least something, at least at the intermediate level of that coding skill. Now, why do we need them at an intermediate level? It's because the data engineers can't write all of their code, at the same time as we don't need them to be at the level of coding skill that a data engineer is at. As far as data scientists, the two most common programming languages at this point in time are Python and Scala, with Python being used significantly more. So that should help you understand which languages we're looking for. Then we have to interview our data scientists on the data science itself, the statistical background. We need to make sure that they understand statistics. Do they understand the basic statistics in order to choose or interpret data? We also need to make sure that they understand what is the right model for a particular use case. For some companies, we may actually have an even deeper part, and there may be a specific area or question that we're trying to go through, where we might have a specific part of our research or a specialty that those data scientists need. And this is something that you'll need to know up front. As a direct result, we may actually need to ask them questions about that particular area of research. For example, we might have a classification problem. At that point in time, we'll want to zoom in on classification questions. Or if it's computer vision sort of questions. If we're doing clear text analysis, sentiment analysis might be a domain specific or research specific part of that. Or if we're in a particular area or industry where it requires very specific domain knowledge, what we may want to do is ask questions specifically about that. For example, if we are trying to do a bunch of geospatial analytics, we'll want to make sure that the data scientist actually understands how to do geospatial analytics. And then there are other ones where there's a huge amount of domain knowledge that's part of this. And I often see this in the medical industry and in the finance industry. For example, we would have to expect our data scientists maybe not to be the level of a doctor, a medical doctor, but they may need to understand this, and this part for an analytic, for some kind of AI, for some kind of machine learning model. Next, we have our operations interview. And one of the difficult parts for an operations engineer is the wide array of programming skills that companies will expect. Some companies will expect their operations engineers to actually know how to program, sometimes don't expect any programming, or some will expect a level of scripting ability. What you want to do is make sure that you decide ahead of time what level you're expecting and communicate that. It isn't fair to an operations engineer for you to expect a programming background and not have said that. This is a bad thing for both sides. Then there are the frameworks themselves. You will need to know what frameworks you're expecting them to know and to operate on. And in turn, the person will need to know the operation for those frameworks. And you'll want to make sure that they've actually done this in production. Have they actually done this before? This is an important part of can they actually do it? And then there's a whole different part of that. Maybe they've done this before. Maybe they've done it at a very small scale, for example. So what was the scale of that operation? If they were doing a very small scale operation and you're at a much higher level, how much will they be able to, how big of an issue is that? Will you be able to teach them on the job? Will you be able to do this and that? These are important things that we need to ascertain as we start to go through and work with our operations and do our operations engineer interviews. Now that you've understood about the differences and the importance of these interviews, I invite you to purchase and read Data Teams so that you can understand even more about each one of these positions and what it needs to do.